Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And this afternoon, we have with us FPRI's very own Robert Strausz-Hupé, chair in Geopolitics, Robert D. Kaplan, who's going to be talking about his new book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian. And he's going to be doing that in a conversation with our Ron Granieri, who's the executive director of FPRI's Center for the Study of America and the West. Ron is also a history professor at the U.S. Army War College, which means we have to stipulate that his comments here do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the War College, the U.S. Army, or the Department of Defense. Before we get started, I'd also like to mention that we have a brand new Robert Strausz-Hupé project named aptly after our founder, Ambassador Robert Strausz-Hupé. And stay tuned, we'll be telling you more about that in the coming weeks. Before I turn it over to Ron, just a few housekeeping notes. Number one, if you have questions, and we'll be turning to questions about halfway through, please put them in the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, and that way Ron will be sure to see them. In our chat, we'll be putting a link to Bob's new book. We'll also follow the conversation and, as appropriate, be putting some maps, links to maps in the chat as well. We'll also be videotaping today so that you can listen to it again afterwards or share it with your friends. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors and our board and our members for their generosity. We cannot do it without you, so we're deeply grateful. Without further ado, let me turn it over to Ron.
Thank you, Raleigh, and thank you, everyone out there. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest episode of People, Politics, and Prose, FPRI's new program of conversations with authors about their works, their careers, and the ideas that drive them. I am Ron Granieri. I'll be your host and moderator, and all of us at FPRI thank you for joining us on Zoom. It's a pleasure to be with us. The motto of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, is simple, quote, "From the American people," unquote. It offers an image of American generosity, offering help to peoples in need. Humanitarian assistance has been part of American foreign policy for at least 7 decades, yet its place in American geopolitical conceptions has been uneven at best. Often elbowed aside, literally and figuratively, by military action, it also suffers from terrible PR, as most American voters falsely assume that foreign aid means vast sums wasted on corrupt foreigners rather than being put to better use at home. It makes sense to be careful about discussing humanitarian assistance. After all, any government action will, indeed should, align with foreign policy goals and is thus never free from national interest. And some aid efforts do fail to help their official targets. Nevertheless, humanitarian assistance can do genuine good in the service of both humanity and American foreign policy. Perhaps the best way to understand the place of humanitarian assistance in American foreign policy of its variety of levels is to consider the individuals who advance that policy on the ground. One such person was Robert Gersony, whose fieldwork and reports for a range of American and international organizations from the 1960s to the 2010s took him from the Vietnam War to the Rwandan Genocide, with stops across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Along the way, Gersony made the acquaintance of an ambitious young reporter, Robert Kaplan, whose travels and analyses matched Gersony's in breadth and depth. Kaplan came away so impressed that he has now written a new biography, The Good American, the epic life and adventures of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian. In it, he tells the story of a man whose greatest accomplishments went unrecognized by the public, but known by those who sent him and those whom he helped. Quote, "To call Gersony great is to diminish him," Kaplan writes, "since greatness usually involves an unusual degree of ambition, concealed or unconcealed. Gersony was not ambitious, but he served higher ideals." Kaplan concludes, "A meaningful life is about truth, not success." Gersony served his truth and was, in his own way, successful. But who was Bob Gersony? And how did he and people like him support American foreign policy? What can we learn from his story and from his example? Those questions and yours will guide us in discussion with our guest, Robert D. Kaplan, who is indeed the Robert Strausz-Hupé Chair in Geopolitics at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the best-selling author of 19 books on foreign affairs and travel, translated into many languages. In addition to The Good American, he's the author of The Revenge of Geography, Asia's Cauldron, Monsoon, The Coming Anarchy, and Balkan Ghosts. For 3 decades, he reported on foreign affairs for The Atlantic, and he was a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and the Navy's Executive Panel. Foreign Policy Magazine twice named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers, and we are delighted to have him with us today. Good afternoon, Bob Kaplan.
Well, thank you so much to you, Ron, and to FPRI for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I want to start at the very beginning here. Who was Bob Gersony, and what inspired you to want to tell his story?
Bob Gersony was the son of Jewish Holocaust refugees who grew up fairly wealthy in Manhattan, but not only didn't go to college, he quit high school and ended up in Vietnam, where he was awarded a Bronze Star for service. And got his start in Guatemala, starting a language school, teaching both Spanish and indigenous Mayan languages in Antigua, in Guatemala. He was noticed by people from the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, and that started him on his career of over 4 decades of literally being on the ground in almost every war and disaster emergency. He was the greatest humanitarian you never heard of. And that was the point of writing the book, that the really extraordinary people are not famous. He was, he was in conflict zones for decades, and in every case, he interviewed hundreds of refugees in each conflict zones, collated the evidence, and led to American policy being a bit smarter and a bit more humane, sometimes dramatically so, in almost every case. I call Bob Gersony a Saul Bellow character, right out of a Saul Bellow novel, tortured, full of anxiety, self-critical, just like the characters you meet in Saul Bellow's fiction, yet operating a Joseph Conrad type of setting of third world nightmares. And so he was a very unusual person with absolutely no ego. He had no desire to write a book of his own. I had to convince him to do this. And it's, it's a story of how the really great people you never hear of. Yeah. And one more thing. Sure. I take the reader on the ground through foreign policy disasters and emergencies for 40 years. And, it's a very geopolitical, geographical book, but this is from the ground up rather than from the top down.
Right. Well, and the literary elements, right, that we are talking about, and you call it an epic story. It's an epic adventure. I'm curious about Gersony's relationship, American and international officialdom. So he starts with USAID, but that's not the only organization he ever works for. And how did he move? He needed official commission in various places to then do the work that he did. And how did he manage that over the course of his career?
Well, Bob Gersony was essentially a freelancer in the spiritual sense. He had to be rehired for each assignment. He was never a staffer, never officially a Foreign Service officer, even though his life exemplifies the Foreign Service at its best. As I said, he started in Guatemala and did his first assignments for USAID in Central and South America, and then moved over to the State Department, which was a step up because USAID was always second fiddle to the State Department historically. And at the State Department, he started his career in Africa, where his greatest work would turn out to be. He also went to Asia and many other places. He was essentially hired, in some cases by hospitals at AFD. In terms of the State Department, he worked for the Refugee and Humanitarian Bureaus, sometimes for the Africa Bureau, or for what's called the law bureaus, the geographic bureaus, Africa, Latin America, South, East Asia, etc. So he had different bosses not in every assignment, but in many times he had different bosses, and he always had to get hired again, new. And this was difficult because even though almost every assignment was a success, he also ruffled feathers. In many cases, he embarrassed the department because he exposed human rights abuses that the department didn't know about up until the time he went there, and it became public. Like in one famous instance regarding Uganda in 1984, where he actually leaked information to the Washington Post because nobody in the State Department can handle it or deal with it or wanted to promote it. It all turned out okay, but like a lot of extraordinary people, it wasn't that he had enemies. He made people uncomfortable, and yet he still managed to get hired again and again and again. So overall, and this is a good comment on the State Department during the Cold War and early post-Cold War, the State Department was open-minded about his analyses, even though his analyses often went against official opinion within the building.
And so did he, when he wrote his reports, right, would they be routed through the local US representatives, or did they go directly back to Washington?
Well, you write a cable for the State Department. It officially is sent out not by you, but by the ambassador in that country, even if you've written it and the ambassador just rubber stamps it. Gotcha. So he would write a cable. It would be read by his bosses, which in many cases were first secretaries, deputy chiefs of mission ambassadors, then would go officially to the Secretary of State, but in reality, to the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa or Latin America or the Refugee Programs Bureau or whatever. One of the things I bring out in the book is that the old-time State Department of the Cold War operated like a lot of the great print and typewriter newspapers. It was about reporting. To be productive in the Foreign Service was a term of art. It meant to be a good cable writer. And he became a very good cable writer because he had great mentors who I also write about and bring to life in the book.
Right. And you met him for the first time, we were talking about, in Sudan, dealing with Eritrean refugees. And this would have been during the era of the Ethiopian dictatorship and the famines in the region. And what was your first impression when you met him in Sudan?
Yes, it was April 1985, the Acropole Hotel, like a cheap hotel in Khartoum, Sudan, and it was filled with relief workers and journalists who were covering what was then one of the biggest media stories of the decade, the Great Ethiopian Famine of the mid-1980s. Tens of thousands of victims flooded over the border into Sudan. This idea that human rights only came to the fore after the end of the Cold War was nonsense, because it was a major story throughout the 1980s. And, human rights workers, journalists are very, very talkative types, very social types, or else they wouldn't be doing what they're doing. And, they like they like to gossip, to exchange information. And I was introduced to this person who was quiet. It was clear everything about him was quiet. He didn't, small talk was not what he did. Essentially. And he was very intense, very warm at the same time. And we immediately connected. And then, as it happened, he became a source for me. And I did my first piece ever for the Atlantic Monthly on Sudan in 1985. And then I went to Uganda for my second piece for The Atlantic based on information that he gave me, essentially. So that's where we met for the first time. He was very unusual. He was sort of like in the human rights community, but not of the human rights community, because he clearly had an analytical math brain. Because though he didn't go to college, he did work in the commodity and was quite successful at it as a young man.
Interesting. And the way that you describe him as someone who is quiet but interested, I would say, those must have been the skills that allowed him to get people to open up to him. The people that interviewed refugees who are frightened, refugees who are disconcerted. He was able to get information from them about their situations to put into his reports. Yes. Am I correct? That was the strength of his reports, was essentially his reporting.
Yes. He was a great listener. Bob Gersony, throughout his career, was a great listener. He developed into a very good briefer because his reports became so legendary that he would come back from sleeping in a sleeping bag in the bush for weeks and be escorted up to brief George Shultz, then the Secretary of State. This was common for him, but it developed because he was at first, he was at base root a good listener, and he could listen for hours. He could never ask leading questions, but he got people to talk by not interrupting the silences. When there was a silence between him and a refugee, rather than interject because silences are awkward, he stayed silent, and then they continued to spill out the evidence, essentially. It was all about listening and writing down, because he was not a fan of the tape recorder. Because in those days in Africa, to have a tape recorder, made it a hassle with officialdom, with border guards at airports, because they were very suspicious of what you had. It wasn't like today at all. There was no email, and your safest mechanism was just have a notebook and pen.
And was Gersony a linguist as well, in order to get these interviews with people? I mean, had he developed that many different language skills that he could interview folks?
He spoke fluent Spanish, and to the degree that he was an area specialist, he was a Central American area specialist. And there were a lot of wars there that he covered in the course of his career, and which are in the book. He spoke some German. But otherwise, he was not a linguist, but it might not have mattered very much. For instance, in Mozambique, where he, spent months in a war zone in this sprawling country, stretched over 1,500 miles, he was interviewing people who spoke 11 different dialects. So he needed, the kind of translators he used, it would have just been impossible really to have an advantage by knowing just one dialect, or one language.
Interesting. And clearly he did not allow initial language barriers to stop him from entering into these conversations with people. So that's a skill in itself.
No. And his basic mode of operation was he never considered backbreakingly poor refugees to be less expert at their body of knowledge than he was at his. He didn't look down to them. He didn't talk down to them. He considered them experts who were experts about what they had been through. And he treated them with deference, with complete politeness, without being patronizing. And he got them to talk because he saw them on an equal level, even at a higher level than him, because he didn't know what they had gone through. He was depending on them to tell him and to explain it to him.
A question that's come in here from Gordon Bear about how can the State Department sort of build on this Gersony's approach. I want to massage that question a little bit and ask you, do you think the fact that Gersony's background was so unconventional, right? The idea that he didn't go to college, that he didn't go through the usual process, that he wasn't a career Foreign Service officer. did that shape his willingness to be so open to different folks? And did he ever open up to you about the relationship between his sort of personal biography and his approach to his work?
I think his great advantage, getting to the question, is that he was not captured by any bureaucratic groupthink. Because all bureaucracies, all organizations that are larger than 10 people even, have a certain groupthink. It may be much smaller on small organizations, but certainly when you're dealing with the State Department, USAID, even the human rights organizations who want to do good, if they're big, there is a groupthink. There is a corridor personality. And he was not captured by any of that. And therefore, he was not conditioned as to what to think about a crisis, who the good guys were, who the bad guys were. He more or less strove to be totally ignorant, except for reading a lot of books beforehand about the history of the country, the geography, etc. But in terms of who is right and who is wrong, he strove for ignorance and let the refugees steer him. As he always told me, refugees don't lie. When they come straggling across the border, they're the best experts in the world as to what they've been through. Satellite photographs, wire intercepts from intelligence agencies won't help you as much as a refugee talking to you.
This gets to an interesting question of, are people like Gersony, are they born or are they made? He certainly, is the product of his own experiences, but is it possible to train Foreign Service officers, humanitarian officers? Is it possible to train people to be like him? Or what do you think?
You can train people how to conduct interviews and all this. And this is all in the book, by the way.
Right.
He goes through his 10 ideas for how you interview people, etc. But it's not a matter of training people to be like him, because he's unusual. He's very Shakespearean, right. He's but what you can do is create a bureaucratic procedures and a bureaucratic personality that allows people to first go to the field, not be tethered to their computers in the embassy office on answering 150 emails from Washington, giving them the leeway to actually go into the field and having a setup where they can come back and contradict the official policy or groupthink without getting into trouble, essentially. One of the problems of the internet age is that diplomats are often stuck in the embassy because there are emails that come in like crazy, not just from the State Department, but from Commerce and this agency and that, wanting to know this and that.
Right. And so we were talking before we went on, and you were describing how we have the illusion of knowledge because so much material is at our fingertips, especially in the internet age. And yet, what do we really know if we are not there, if we're not actually speaking to the people who
it happens again and again. Like I was just in Turkey in October and November, and I spoke to a lot of Turkish experts, and I read a lot. And then when I got to Turkey, it wasn't that it was totally different. It wasn't. But all the really good stuff I learned can only have been learned by talking to people there, essentially. In other words, we have this because of social media, because of the internet. We think we know what's going on in a place, but all we have is the shadows, the great contours, all the nuances, the delicious little nuances we don't have. You can only get that by going to a place. And even going to a place, as Bob Gersony's life exemplifies, is not enough. You have to get out of the capital city and into the deserts or into the bush, etc. He always found capitals boring. Capital cities. His capital cities were full of embassies, and embassies were an extension of Washington or Paris or London, depending on which embassy you went to. But it was only when you took a bus 300 miles away from a capital city in a place like Mozambique or Uganda did you really find out, number one, what's happening, and most importantly, does the central government have any control in that area?
Mhm. And that's Walter McDougall has written in a question where he notes that too many people who go out to do good, that they disregard James Kurth's famous dictum, they disregard the desire to understand the realities and mentalities of the localities. Clearly, Gersony was interested in doing that. How does somebody manage to do that in so many different places?
Bob Gersony is a pessimist. Now, that's not a bad thing for the human rights field, because being a constructive pessimist means you find out the worst or that could happen in order to prevent it from happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's about he thought tragically in order to avoid greater tragedy. It's like anxious foresight. He was at root a pessimist, and he also was a realist in the sense he understood that if any policy he recommended or anything he brought back from the field, if not insert itself into some conception of the national interest, it wasn't going to be acted upon. Mm-hmm. So, human rights are great in the abstract, but unless unless you can make an argument how pursuing this particular human rights policy or that helps the national interest of the United States, in Gersony's case, you're not going to get any effective action in mm-hmm. this sense. So he was very good at merging realism with idealism, human rights with national interest. They may be opposites, but they can be melded together.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I want to talk about some of the places where Gersony was active, and especially in Africa, which frankly is a place where American hard power is, let's say, intermittently applied. And so a place where there is a great deal of room to operate for soft power organizations and a great deal of humanitarian issues to deal with. Gersony is famous for his reporting from and his reaction to the Rwanda Genocide. And could you tell our listeners about how he ended up in Rwanda and what happened to this famous Gersony report?
Yes. Basically, it was a total accident that got him to Rwanda. His wife, Cindy, who was also a humanitarian relief worker, mm-hmm. What happened to be seated on a plane next to Brian Atwood, who at the time in 1994 was the administrator of USAID, which means he ran USAID, mm-hmm. Appointed by the president. And she mentioned to him that Gersony had briefed him years back about the situation in Nicaragua. And Atwood said, "Oh boy, do I remember that briefing. That was one of the best briefings I ever got." So Gersony's name was in Atwood's mind at the time that Atwood had to do something about the Rwandan genocide. So Atwood essentially, and this is to make a long story short, it's a very long chapter. Atwood is essentially loans me to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Sadako Ogata at the time, and she sent Gersony to Rwanda. This was right after the genocide, to travel around Rwanda and to find out what was going on. Because people weren't returning home from over the border in the Congo and Tanzania, and she wanted to know why, now that the violence was ended. Well, at that point in time, what was thought by the world and what was known was that the Hutus had carried out a genocide of the Tutsis in which 850,000 people were murdered. Okay. And so the Hutus were cast as the total bad guys and the Tutsis as the victims, essentially. And it was a simple story. Mm-hmm. Well, Gersony wound up interviewing hundreds of refugees throughout the country under harrowing conditions. And what he discovered was, yes, this was all true, but now that there was an effective Tutsi government in power in Rwanda, it was effectively murdering large numbers of Hutus. Not 850,000, not a genocide, but 10,000, 20,000. It was a mass murder, though much less than the original genocide. But it was going on, it was ongoing. And this was a very difficult truth for the UN, for the United States, for the world at large, for the international relief to countenance, to accept, because they much preferred this black and white situation where one side was essentially the Nazis and the other side were the Jews, and there was complete innocence or complete evil. And well, in fact, it was much different. You know, he muddied the waters of the story that the State Department had agreed to, essentially. And so he came out with this report. He briefed all the officials. There was a lot of comments like, you're making our lives difficult for us, Mr. Gersony. This is not what we want to hear, essentially. But Bob Gersony was motivated truth, which in this age of fake news, of lies, is very important. Facts were very important. And his point of view was, I don't care if it muddies the narrative, if it makes your policy somewhat incoherent, if it makes life difficult. You asked me to find out what was going on. This is what's going on. Well, to make a long story short, Kofi is then not yet the Secretary General of the UN, but the head of peacekeeping operations. And Madame Ogata, who is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, essentially stopped the repatriation of refugees and put pressure on the new Ugandan regime to stop the killings cold. You see? So he helped bring an end to the killings. But at the same time, he hadn't actually written a report yet. Then he wrote a report, and Mrs. Ogata, who passed away recently, put the report in her safe because the report was too controversial for the UN to come out with, because the UN at the time was supporting the new regime because there was no other option at the time, and they wanted to get stability in the country. And in the long run, they did get stability in the country. But the report was really something very politically incorrect at the time. Now, it wasn't a very well-written report. It wasn't a thick, lengthy, brilliant report of the kind he wrote in other parts of the world where he had months to work on his writing. But it was a report of what he had found in dry bureaucratic language. Well, because the UN never released it, it became both famous and infamous in the human rights community. And there were all these dark conspiracies associated to this secret report or the so-called report, or why wasn't it released, so to speak. I actually saw the report, one of the people to see it. And when you read all of his work over his lifetime, which I've done, it pales in significance. But at that time, the story is much more effective, and what he found out is much more effective than the written report.
Did the controversy, as quiet as it was, did the controversy over the report affect his future relationships with the UN and or the State Department?
Well, officially, no. But after Rwanda, what happened was, as soon as he finished his Rwanda assignment, he went back to working in Nicaragua, where he's conducting this long-term, multi-year project of developing the Atlantic coast for the benefit of the Mosquito Indians and others there. See, Gersony never became famous because he never networked. And he never networked because he was rarely in New York or Washington. When he came back from the field, he didn't go to New York or Washington. He went to a place like Nicaragua, you see. So over the years, his report was complete, his so-called, his findings, we'll say, were completely vindicated. Eventually became the conventional wisdom of the human rights community. But at the beginning, it was the kind of information that nobody wanted to hear.
Interesting. Now, to circle back, and especially Murray Levin asked a question about, did Gersony have many dealings with the great and the good, the higher ups in the State Department, in the diplomatic field? I know that you mentioned that he did brief George Shultz when Shultz was Secretary of State. But for a guy who didn't network, and a guy who would consider coming back from Africa and going to the Atlantic coast of Nicaragua, what was his place in Washington, in New York, among the big name folks, the bold-faced names of diplomacy?
There are two subcultures, Washington and New York. All right. Gersony's subculture was Washington. And in the State Department, as Elliot Abrams tells me, which is in the book, he said Gersony was extraordinary because here was this mere contractor. He wasn't even a staffer. And he didn't work for the prestigious geographic line bureaus like African Affairs or East Asian Affairs or Latin American Affairs. He worked for like the Refugee Programs Bureau. But when he came back, he had walking privileges with the assistant secretaries of state, undersecretaries of state, and periodically with the secretary of state, because they knew he would come back with, as Elliot Abrams says, with news, with the kind of information and stories that they couldn't get from the CIA, that they couldn't get from USAID or anyone else. And he could explain to them in tactile terms what the war experience was like for common people on the ground. Though he was never officially a journalist, he would, the way to think of him as one of the great correspondents of the era.
Right. So in other words, so he's a reporter in that he reports. So he's never a program manager. So he's never the guy who shows up with largesse to dispense. But his production is heading. But it's the information he sends back up the chain.
His worst nightmare would be to be promoted out of what he was doing.
So that is, of course, it's impossible. You mentioned that he didn't have ambition. Or I would modify that and say that his ambition was to tell the truth, which, as ambitions go, that's a pretty good one to have. But he certainly was not ambitious in terms of seeking higher positions, higher offices.
No, he never wanted to work in Washington. He wanted to be in the field. And again, that's like the greatest foreign correspondents who want to be in the field. Their worst nightmare is to be appointed as foreign editor and go back to the home office or something like that, which is, even though it's a promotion, for them makes for a much less interesting life.
Right. And Mike Noonan just has a comment here, which is a very good one, that Gersony sounds like a non-scoundrel version of Flashman. He's everywhere. He's always at these places. And as a pessimistic optimist, right, this idea that you go places, you're alive to the possibilities of tragedy, but you still want to collect the truth and try to do something about it. What do you think is the best way to encourage that kind of mindset? So if somebody reads this story and say, I would like to look at the world and I'd like to serve, even if it's not a practical question, I want to be the next Bob Gersony, but if I want to look at the world like Bob Gersony, what do you think one should read or think about, or what did he, what were his role models or his intellectual inspirations to be the sort of person he was?
He was, first of all, Bob Gersony, as I explain in the book, was twice exceptional. He actually had a learning disability in his younger years. And that's why he couldn't remember what he read. And it's why he dropped out of high school, essentially. Right. But over the years, he could only remember by typing what he read, Okay. And he spent his life with a typewriter and a pen and notebook, essentially. He basically, whenever he got an assignment, he would always read deeply into the local history and culture. When you see his library at home, there are no books on globalization, but there are books about the globe. about he's like one of the last of the 19th century area specialists. He's very much like the Arabists, the China hands, etc., except he understands, he's done many different areas in the course of his life. He understands that a traveler's account from 100 years ago may help him more than a briefing from a think tank in Washington. Kind of, he's not at all like the people who are part of the foreign policy elite today.
And I guess that's both a big mark in his favor. Frankly, it's also a little depressing, right? That somebody who is this interesting is also so rare. And one wonders, do institutions make sure that there are as few people like this as possible out there? That's what I wonder about. What do you think?
He's much more interesting than most of the big shots that I've met in my life. And because he can go into depth about the various factions in Uganda or Mozambique or Central or Guatemala, whatever, and switch from country to country, essentially. But there's no school that's going to teach you how to be Bob Gersony. You have to be an adventurous reader of bibliographies. To search into the bibliographies of books in order to find out the gems that will teach you about a place.
Interesting. Donald Camp pointed out earlier on this conversation, I noticed that we were using a lot of past tense, but you have moved into the present tense to talk about Bob Gersony. What's he doing now?
Well, Bob Gersony is he'll be 76 in February, I believe. He'll be 76 in February. He's in excellent health, and he has 3 children. He married late, and him and his wife expected to have one child, and they had triplets. I mean, and the triplets are
very efficient.
Yeah, triplets are all in college. They're all wonderful kids. Wonderful kids, and he's very much with us. When I asked him, or some people had asked him, would you be willing to go on this event with Bob Kaplan? And he doesn't want, he prefers not to. He is really the opposite of a publicity seeker.
Which there's I 2 questions that I see here in the Q&A that both sort of fit together. One is from Janaki Ray, who says, why doesn't the State Department use him to train Foreign Service officers? I gather it's similar to this idea that you have to feel as Gersony and you can't train him. But then Jim Popita also asked the question, which you bring up in your book, the idea that Gersony's story is in some ways, it's a parallel to your own. The idea of someone who likes to get down into the field, wants to be on the ground, that has, let's say, opinions about the folks who stay 10,000 feet up and offer their opinions. This goes back to the question from the very beginning of this conversation, and that is, what brought you into deciding to tell Gersony's story, right? You've known him for going on 35 years. And at what point did you know that you wanted to write his story, or was all along, did you have that sense?
It's an interesting question, because I met him, as I said, in 1985 in Sudan. And here and there over the decades, we would find ourselves, we would both be in the same country, but a month apart, whether in Nepal or West Africa or Liberia, or I would get there before he did. Then I would find out he came, or he came and I went later. And we'd have phone conversations here and there. Occasionally we'd meet over the decades. And it was like I knew something, but I didn't know that I knew it. I said, there's Bob, he's going away. Other journalists go for a few days into the field to interview refugees. Bob's going for 3 weeks, and he was always, I'm in with refugees. How long will you be there? At least a month. It was something nobody ever did, but it didn't gel. It didn't click with me. Then what happened was about 4 years ago, a mutual friend of ours passed away, and Bob got in contact with me if I could write a story about this person. And I did. And it's someone who's a character in the book, Jerry Weaver, who rescued the many thousands of Jewish falashas refugees from Sudan. Well, so I wrote an article, and so Bob and I decided to have dinner together. So we had dinner. We had dinner at the Cosmos Club in Washington. Okay. And in the course of the dinner, I asked Bob, oh, by the way, where did you go to school? Because I expected him to say Yale or Harvard or Princeton, because he worked for the State Department and USAID his whole life.
Right.
That's where you went to school if you worked in those institutions or places like those. And he said very quietly, actually, I didn't go to college, and I was very shocked. And I said, well, where'd you go to high school? And then he said, well, actually, I never did finish high school. I said, well, what did you do? He said, oh, I went to Vietnam, and then it clicked that here was somebody with a real extraordinary life story. It just clicked. Everything came into focus. And then I started asking people about him, old timers at the State Department and such. And they said, oh, yeah, I mean, he's an extraordinary character. You mean nobody's done a book on him yet or something like that? So that's when I decided to approach him to do this story. It all started with the uniqueness of the individual, essentially. So that's when I approached him, and he said, is there really a story in me? You sure you want to do a book on this? So finally he said yes, and he was very, very cooperative, all in all.
And you talk about how he kept voluminous diaries, wrote memos. And so are we, this is clearly, I remember a previous interview we did, we talked about how, you're not an internet guy in general. And so was this one of these situations where a fella says, you're welcome to use my archive, and then gestures to a storage locker that's full of hundreds of boxes of yellowed typewritten pieces of paper?
Well, because I decided to organize the book chronologically in terms of chapters, starting with Vietnam and ending in Central America with the current border crisis that we have now, because that's accidentally where he ended his career in 2013.
Right.
What he would do is a big stack of notes and files for each individual country. And we would do one country at a time, but it would add up to like a massive file cabinet.
Right. And there are, I'm sure whenever you get interviewed, Bob, somebody asks you a variation of the question I'm about to ask you. And that is, how do you keep up this pace of productivity? Right. So how you selected this particular story is interesting in itself, but also, how do you work?
Well, I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on LinkedIn. I don't blog. I don't have a weekly column. I'll write maybe 10, 12 or so op-ed essayistic pieces per year and do books, and events and things. But I don't eat up my time with social media and its extensions. And that creates a massive amount of time that I can use for writing and researching on books.
I can imagine.
And I don't live in Washington or New York. I live out in the country. Of course, being isolated, it can get too extreme, as all of us have found out over the last 12 months. So I would like to see more of people, and to travel more. But generally, in a normal environment, I socialize and network probably on the whole less than other people.
Gotcha. Well, and yet, this goes back to the issue of Gersony being someone who is interested in people but does not put himself forward. And the question, Adrian Bersora asked this: can you think of a particular case or a couple of cases where we could see Gersony's influence on American policy,
Absolutely.
where there's actually changes? Can you let our listeners
I'll start with Uganda in 1984. Good. Where Gersony, at the time there was, everyone knows about Idi Amin because he was colorful, but he was followed by Milton Obote, who was a very boring, methodical mass murderer, who was actually worse than Amin.
Yes.
Gersony uncovered through his field work how Obote had just recently murdered about 100,000 people and starved more to death. And this got to, this got to the State Department. And as a result of making this public, it played a significant role in getting Obote out of office and leading eventually to the coming to power of it, at the time, a very open-minded, idealistic leader in Uganda, Yoweri Museveni. Now, this goes back 37 years almost, and Museveni is still in power. And he's become kind of what he was originally against, over the decades. That happens. But at the time, he was clearly a better alternative to Obote because of all of Museveni's transgressions. He was not a mass murderer, essentially. Then famously in Mozambique in 1988, you remember the Reagan Doctrine, where the Reagan administration supported groups like the rebels in Angola, in Afghanistan, who were basically fighting, for independence, freedom from a Western point of view, supporting the West. Right. And the Reagan Doctrine provided aid to all of these groups. The Reagan administration was on the verge of giving aid to Renamo, a Mozambican resistance organization that was to be added to the Reagan Doctrine. And Gersony's interviewing of several hundred refugees from all the border areas around Mozambique and inside war-torn Mozambique instead revealed that Renamo were a bunch of murderers, essentially. They had no policy. They were guilty of rape, torture, everything. And it was Gersony's report that got the Reagan administration to pull aid away from Renamo at the last minute. The Assistant Secretary of State of Africa at the time, Chester Crocker, who comes out as a real hero in my book, he's a major character, basically said that that Gersony, Margaret Thatcher, and one or two others were responsible for bringing Mozambique to peace. Because by pulling aid from Renamo, it allowed Crocker and then his successor at state, Herman Hank Cohn, to basically play a big role in ending the Mozambican Civil War, bring it to peace, and that in turn played a role to ending apartheid in South Africa, which occurred a few years later. It started with not supporting Renamo, which Gersony was an instigator of, and which Margaret Thatcher, from another point of view, backed him up, basically.
Fascinating. I mean, certainly people who remember those years remember that there was a lot of pressure within the Reagan administration to essentially support Renamo, a lot of political pressure, and that's very interesting.
Renamo was seen as just an analog of UNITA and Angola, and it turned out that they weren't. They were much worse. And then, of course, there was Rwanda, where I explained, where his reporting got the UN and the United States to bring pressure to bear on Paul Kagame's government to end the mass killings. And Kagame has gone on to being a very efficient, very capable, very authoritarian leader, not the guy we really want, but he's brought development to the country. And the mass murder ended mainly because of Gersony's findings. And then I can go on and on in each case. Like in Ethiopia, he uncovered the Isak genocide, where tens of thousands of people were killed. That caused the US government to pull aid from Siad Barre's regime in Somalia. The list goes on.
Fascinating. We just have a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to, especially going to Alfonso Diaz's question. And you mentioned that Gersony was a Spanish speaker. He was heavily interested in Central America. And so you mentioned where he has ended up, or he ended up dealing with the border issues. But what can you say about his work in Latin America and its connection to refugee issues and American policy, broadly speaking? Yeah.
Yes. Violeta Chamorro won election to take power away from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, there was a whole area of northern Nicaragua that required instant development. You know, it was basically in a state of anarchy. And Gersony basically single-handedly calmed the region down by organizing a whole project of bridge building, of clearing land, etc. You know, of all kinds of aid. In El Salvador, you know, a works program he started played a role in getting the civil war there resolved on the side of the non-communists, you know, essentially. So he played a small part in that. Much larger forces at work. He played a role with mitigating the damage that was done by, you know, there was a policy in the George W. Bush administration where the Mexican president would declare total war on the drug cartels, and that led to anarchy. You know, it was the equivalent of toppling Saddam Hussein. When there was nobody in charge, there was all these fights for turf, you know, lower levels, and that led to a situation of anarchy in parts of northern Mexico and central Mexico. And Gersony came up with a plan to help mitigate that. He was also, you know, he was also influential in Honduras after Hurricane Mitch, you know, in getting relief started there. Both him and his wife Cindy were very influential in that.
Well, I have to say, right, that you know, Gersony's life has been really, really something, and I encourage our listeners and our partners out there to get their hands on your book, Bob, to talk about the good American. And as you know, people with an eye towards literary connections, right? You mentioned Joseph Conrad, and so I wonder, you know, the connection between you and Gersony, right? There's a little bit of Conrad's secret sharer in there. People can discover their similarities, but also your reference to the good American, right? Gersony was not necessarily the quiet American, but he was and certainly the image of an American worker who is out there doing what is not just serving short-term American political interest, but who's trying to do well by doing good, I guess, to try to make that work.
And also not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, because in here and there were, you know, purists who didn't like his policy because it couldn't completely solve the problem.
Right. And that's and I guess that's a willingness to continue to grapple with the issues for real, rather than get caught up in abstractions. And so, Bob, thank you so much for this conversation today. I'm afraid that's all the time we have, but it's great for having you with us. And thanks for sharing your insights. And remember to our listeners that The Good American is indeed available now for purchase. FPRI would like to thank our sponsors and partners for their generous support, and all of you for joining us here on Zoom. Today's conversation is just the beginning. The world goes on, and we will continue to discuss it here at FPRI. If you have enjoyed our discussion today, please tell a friend and bring a friend next time as we get to analyze our complex world. Please note also, if you enjoyed this conversation, that Bob will indeed be hosting a podcast for FPRI beginning later this spring, Great Power or Rivalry in the Age of Global Demons, where he will be talking to some of the most brilliant scholars that you may not yet have heard of. And so to keep up with those episodes and with other episodes of People, Politics, and Prose and other events at FPRI, visit our website, fpri.org. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. You can follow the host of this program on Twitter at Ronald Granieri. Please consider becoming a member and partner of FPRI so that we can continue to organize discussions like this. But until next time, for all of us at FPRI, I'm Ron Granieri. Thanks for joining us.